Getting me look.
You got two.
Okay, awesome. My name is Colleen. I'm a PhD candidate in environmental engineering at Northwestern, and I'm actually speaking to you all today from just down the road on Fullerton, so it's nice to meet some neighbors. And I'll be talking today about how green spaces can help cities combat climate change. So climate change has been in the news a lot lately, especially in 2020. There were 22 weather and climate related disasters with losses that exceeded more than $1 billion each. So the total amount of damages last year in the US caused by weather related disasters was over $95 billion. So these have a really big economic impact. And we hear a lot about the impacts of climate change in places like California, where there's been really devastating wildfires, or in the Gulf of Mexico or the southeastern coast of the US, where they've been experiencing more extreme and more frequent hurricanes. And even in the Midwest here, we've heard about the impacts of severe flooding in places like Missouri and Ohio, among many others in the last few years. But we don't always hear much about how climate change will affect the city of Chicago. So what will climate change look like here? Well, for starters, we're expected to experience hotter and drier winters. So the number of days over 95 degrees is expected to increase from currently less than 1 per year to about 37 days per year in 2080. The Chicago summer precipitation is also expected to decrease from about 11.8 inches to 11.4 inches, which is pretty significant for the growing season and the amount of precipitation that we receive overall in the summer. On the other hand, our winters are expected to get warmer and wetter. So the average winter temperature is expected to increase by about 9 degrees by 2070. And the winter precipitation is also expected to increase by about 1 inch each winter. And so these warmer temperatures mean that most likely Chicago winters will be rainier rather than snowier. So how does this impact us? Well, for starters, these increase in precipitation in the winter is expected to lead to more flooding, because not only will we receive more rain, but these rainstorms are expected to become more intense. So that'll mean more rain over a shorter period of time, which is more likely to contribute to flooding. Like I mentioned before, we're also expected to see an increase in the number of days over 95 degrees, so more frequent and longer lasting heat waves. And this increase in air temperature is related to a decrease in air quality. So as it gets hotter, the air quality in Chicago will also get worse. So this means that it will all impact our infrastructure, our economy, and our health. So now that I've painted this not so pretty picture of what Chicago could look like in 50 years due to climate change, we want to know what we can do about it. And that's where urban green spaces come into play. And so what I mean by urban green spaces are any parks, gardens, athletic fields, tree-lined streets, grassy knolls, any green space that you see in a city is considered urban green spaces. And they have these really important benefits. I'm going to focus on 4 benefits today that all relate to mitigating the impact of climate change. So the first one is absorbing air pollutants. The next one is cooling surrounding areas, providing carbon storage, and reducing flooding. So how do green spaces do all of these things? We'll start with air pollution and for starters. So the plants and trees in green spaces can absorb air pollutants like ozone and nitrogen dioxide through small pores on their leaves. And then they can digest those gases so that they're taken out of the atmosphere where they can be inhaled by people and worsen the symptoms of asthma or other respiratory illnesses. The leaves on trees and plants can also act as a surface for small particles in the air to land on, like dust or soot, and they stick to those leaves and again are taken out of the air where they could be inhaled and could aggravate those respiratory illnesses. Green spaces also have really significant cooling effects, and they do that in a number of different ways. The first way is that vegetated areas like grass or trees increase the amount of sunlight that's reflected back out into the atmosphere. So when you have pavement like asphalt or concrete that are usually black or dark colors, they absorb the heat from the sun and store a lot of it, which keeps the surrounding areas really warm both during the day and at night. But green spaces reflect that sunlight back out into the atmosphere and prevent those surfaces from getting quite as warm. They also provide shade, so the ground surface beneath like a tree canopy is going to absorb a lot less of that sunlight because again, it's being reflected out. And then evaporation from soil and leaves has a cooling effect. So when water evaporates from the surface of leaves or from the soil or grass, it cools the area around it, much the way that when sweat evaporates from your skin, it cools your body. And so this picture here on the left-hand side shows vegetation in New York City. And so the darker green is areas that have more vegetation, and the lighter yellow and white are areas that have much less vegetation. And then on the right-hand side, we see temperature data. And so the darker purple and blue are areas that are a lot cooler, whereas the pink and yellow areas have much higher temperatures. So from these pictures, you can see that there's a really clear relationship between the vegetation and the temperature. Areas that have a lot more vegetation tend to have a lot cooler temperatures. And we see that across many different cities. Green spaces also provide an important area for carbon storage. So much the way that air pollutants are absorbed from the air by the small pores on leaves, carbon dioxide is also removed from the atmosphere and then turned into oxygen through photosynthesis. And that carbon dioxide is then stored in the leaves, trunk, branches, and roots of the trees and the soil below the vegetation. So we know that rising levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is the main driver behind climate change. And so by taking some of this carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, we can help lower those levels and reduce the impacts of climate change. And lastly, green spaces provide really important flood reduction. So on the left-hand side is a kind of stereotypical urban area. You see that it's mostly asphalt with a large parking lot. And when water falls onto that area, that asphalt acts like a racetrack for the water and speeds it up. And so you get a lot of water arriving into the drainage system all at once. And very little of that water is able to be absorbed into the ground below the surface and replenish the groundwater because those surfaces are sealed so tightly. So when all that water arrives at the drainage system at once, it can easily contribute to flooding. On the other side, we have green spaces. And so when the rain falls onto that green space, it acts like a sponge and absorbs a lot of that water, replenishes the groundwater below the surface, and has very little water left remaining to run across the land. And that water that does run across the land, that runoff, is decreased in speed because water moves much more slowly across vegetated areas like grass than it does across asphalt. So it's much less likely to contribute to flooding. So it's great to say that we have all these different benefits of green spaces, but as scientists, we really want to be able to measure those benefits and say for sure how good these green spaces are at providing these different benefits for climate change. So here in Chicago, we've deployed sensors across a lot of different urban green spaces like parks, gardens, urban farms, green roofs, to be able to measure how good these spaces are at providing these benefits. And so this is just an example of a few of the different type of sensors that we often use to measure the impact of these green spaces. So we almost always have a rain gauge, which captures the rain that falls and allows us to determine how much rain fell. Below the surface, we usually have soil moisture sensors and groundwater wells, which allow us to determine how much water is being stored in that green space, how much of that rain was absorbed that would have otherwise contributed to flooding. We also have these small sensors that we call nodes, and those are deployed across the city of Chicago, often on traffic lights or street light poles. And they measure the air quality and temperature. So we have some in places like Lincoln Park near the park, and other places like in the Loop in these really dense urban areas. And we can compare what the air quality looks like close to those green spaces as opposed to in these dense urban areas, and what the benefits of those green spaces might be. And lastly, we have these really large flux towers that measure the exchange of carbon dioxide between plant soils and the atmosphere, and allow us to determine how much of that carbon dioxide is being absorbed from the atmosphere and stored in those plants and soil, and therefore decreasing the carbon dioxide levels. In addition to the many benefits of green space in combating climate change, there are also a lot of benefits of urban green spaces to us as people and residents of cities. In particular, green spaces have been shown to be an important source of stress reduction for city residents. Greener areas also tend to have higher property values. They provide really important recreational spaces and spaces for community gathering. They also increase biodiversity, so the number of plant, insect, and animal species that live in those areas by providing wildlife habitat. And urban gardens can also be a really important source of local food production, especially in food deserts. So by measuring these different benefits of green spaces, we get a lot more local data on those benefits and can make a stronger argument for investment in urban green spaces, not just as a nice to have, but as a really important tool for helping combat the impacts of climate change. And in particular, investment in green spaces here in Chicago is most needed in low-income communities and communities of color that both tend to be most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and also tend to have the least access to green space currently. And so these two figures show the tree canopy in Chicago. And so on the left-hand side, the darker green areas have much more tree coverage. So that's where you would expect to see a lot of tree-lined streets or a lot of parks with these full-grown trees, whereas the lighter green and kind of white areas tend to have a lot less tree coverage. And you can see that that's mostly in the south and western part of the city. And then on the right-hand side, this figure shows the distance to open space, and this time the scale is the reverse. So the lighter green means that you don't have to travel very far to get to any sort of open or green space. But the darker green means that you have to go a lot further distance before you reach some sort of green space or open area. And you can see that again, it's kind of a similar area, the southern and western part of the city, that tend to have to travel much further to reach any sort of green space or open area. And so these are really the priority areas that we want to see more investment in green spaces for, both to enhance the resiliency to climate change, but also to provide all of those other benefits that I mentioned in the last slide. So investing in urban green spaces really allows us to reimagine our cities. We often think of them as concrete jungles, but they're really these urban ecosystems with a lot of plants and animals already living there. And by enhancing these urban green spaces and investing in them more, we can build those urban ecosystems even further and enhance climate resilience, health, and well-being for all of our residents. And so that's it. Thank you so much. And yeah, any questions?
I guess I have some questions.
Sure.
To achieve the ecosystems that you want, kind of seems to need a perfect balance of sunshine and moisture. We have parts of the world are experiencing extreme temperatures. The Colorado River is drying up. We're worried about enough moisture out there. Africa is drying up, and I'm sure I think there are places around the world that are flooding. So it's kind of hard, I think, with extreme changes to achieve the systems that you want.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so we do see that kind of these natural systems tend to be more resilient to changes in climate than man-made systems. So for example, like a green space can more naturally acclimate to changes in the climate as opposed to like a sewer system, because that's man-made and you're going to have to dig up the ground to be able to expand the capacity. So we do see that these systems can be really resilient to climate change, but that is a really important point. And so when we plan these new systems, we try specifically to think about using more drought resilient plants or plants that absorb more water. So we try to accommodate the anticipated changes in climate when developing these green spaces as well.
Good luck.
In your planning, are you trying to use what are now native plants, or looking to the future of warmer plants that will then be native to the projected weather?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So right now we're kind of doing both. So for example, there's a project that we're working on at the Botanic Garden, which is looking at a green roof. And right now we're actually studying how those different plants respond. So on one side of the green roof, we have native plants that are mostly like prairie species. And so it really kind of resembles a natural prairie system. And then on the other side of the roof, we have like succulents, much more drought resistant plants, some native species as well, but some non-native. And so we're trying to experiment in that kind of closed system to see how those different plant types do before we introduce a non-native species kind of more widely into the environment to make sure we kind of understand what those impacts are. But yeah, that's a really good question, and one we're still trying to research to figure out what the best way to do that would be.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't, if anyone has any other questions for Nikita now as well, I'll stop sharing my screen and feel free to chime in.
Thank you.
I have a question for Ted. Those slots. Ted.
Oh, Ken.
Those slides with the three graphs. I would have been happy to make a decision off the line results for those results. You saw too wide of divergence. You saw the spread of the results was too wide. You weren't happy with that.
Well, you know, in statistics, you have to go with the little that you have. So I don't know, in my field of research, those aren't too bad, those displays.
Okay.
Because often, for example, the relationship between quality of teaching and what kids learn, it's really low, depressingly low. So those aren't too bad.
Well, I'm sure it's pleased to hear that after you implied that it was pretty widespread.
Well,
That's the one.
let me know if there's a question. I'm not sure if you guys were still talking about those plots. I'm happy to pull them up again.
But we were talking about those three displays, but I don't know if we need to.
Okay.
I was just raising the question as to whether the results coalesced around the line or whether they were too diverse. My associate seemed to imply they were too diverse, but he persuaded me that they were not.
No.
He would accept those.
Okay. I'd be happy to see those in a doctoral dissertation.
Don't scare me with those.
Yeah, so I think the R there was 0.71 for the plot without a race coefficient included, but I think it's not as tight as we would like, and I think it's a good reminder that the way that we calculate this is again an estimation and very imperfect.
Could you repeat those? Which was the 0.71?
The one without the race coefficient.
Okay.
So that was the highest value that they saw in their study, but let me see if I can pull it back up again. Or sorry, 0.75. Without race, it's 0.75, and then with the race variable included, it's 0.61. And so for anyone who doesn't work with R values and these scatter plots, we want closer to 1. Closer to 1 means it's a better fit. And so this 0.61 with the race variable included is not as good of a fit as without the race variable included.
But a correlation of 0.61, you're only accounting for about a quarter or a third of the variance. So that's what happens in statistics.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't mean to say it's the definitely much better than here where we're accounting for much less of the variation. But of course, we want the best fit that we can find.
There's a very important field of research where people spend a lot of time looking at the non-correlates of the displays. So what are those pockets within those areas, like on the right, where we really should look further to see if there's anything important going on, bringing in other variables, because if I read that chart correctly, you're only accounting for 2 of the variables right now, right?
So we're accounting, so the equation itself includes the variables I mentioned. So it includes age, sex, race for 2 of these plots and without race for the other one. And then we added in cystatin C, and then it also includes creatinine. So it's basically the equation which already includes those variables plus cystatin C on the right or minus race in the middle. So it is including all of the variables.
What are the variables? There are 5 variables.
So it's age,
That's a multivariate regression then, I suppose.
sorry?
That's a multivariate regression, I suppose.
It is, yes. I think the way that they did it is they treated the outcome of that equation as one variable, but the equation itself is comprised of age, sex, serum creatinine, plus or minus race.
That one on the right still is not that bad.
One more time. I'm so sorry, I can't hear you guys, but I hear lots of laughs, so I would love to know what you said.
Not that bad, because you're accounting for a lot of variance.
The one on the right, he says.
Right.
The one on the right is a pretty good, it's encouraging that you're working on some, you're accounting for variance, and that's the goal, is to count. And those 5 variables, you're accounting for, what did you say that correlation was again? 0.7. So you're counting for about half of the variance that way.
Yeah, this 0.75.
Squared 49%.
So Nikita, you're gonna be a doctor in a month?
Yeah, I'll be a doctor in a month. Mhm.
You want to argue statistically.
Very exciting.
Does that mean you're gonna become a kidney specialist?
No, I'll be an eye specialist, but this is a big interest of mine.
You're gonna be specialist, I just like kidneys. Okay. Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're both great.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Hope you have a nice evening.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Fantastic.
Seems to me that tomorrow.